There are people who walk into a room and something shifts. Not always in a loud way. Sometimes it is just a word they use, a tone, the way they carry themselves without seeming to notice anyone else, and something in you tightens. You may not even be able to name it. You just know you do not like them. Or more precisely, something about them bothers you in a way that feels disproportionate to what actually happened. You leave the conversation replaying things. You find yourself constructing arguments in your head. You think about what you should have said. You think about what kind of person does that, says that, acts like that. And somewhere in the background, barely audible, is a quieter thought you probably do not stop to examine. Why does this person affect you so much? Not what did they do, not were they wrong, but why specifically does it land in you the way it does? That question tends to go unasked. It is easier to focus on them. But the intensity of the reaction, that is where something real is waiting. She had a colleague at work she could not stand. There was no dramatic incident, no clear moment of betrayal. The colleague was confident, vocal in meetings, never seemed to second-guess herself. She offered opinions without being asked and rarely softened them for the room. To the people around her, the colleague was direct, sometimes polarizing but effective. To her, the colleague was everything she privately despised: arrogant, self-serving, too loud, too sure of herself. She found herself paying close attention to everything the colleague did, cataloging it, noticing every eye roll in a meeting, every comment that went unchallenged, every moment of recognition the colleague received from people whose opinions she cared about. It was exhausting and she knew it, but she could not stop. She told herself it was because the colleague was genuinely difficult, and maybe that was partially true, but the people around her did not seem to notice in the same way. They moved through the same room, watched the same interactions, and went home without carrying any of it. She could not do that. At night, she would lie there thinking about the things the colleague had said, turning them over, finding new ways they were wrong, new evidence for the original verdict. There was one moment, maybe 3 weeks into this, that she almost caught herself. The colleague had been in a meeting and said something that the room laughed at, a genuinely funny comment made without effort, and she had felt something sharp move through her, not amusement, something closer to grief. It passed quickly. She returned to her catalog. But that moment stayed somewhere under the surface, because grief is a strange response to watching someone be funny. Grief does not usually come from external irritation. It tends to come from something much closer. She did not examine it. There was always another meeting, another exchange, another thing the colleague had done that justified the feeling. She kept her attention on the outside, and the feeling kept growing. Step outside the story for a moment. What is actually happening when someone provokes a reaction that deep? There is an assumption that runs beneath most of these experiences. It tends to operate without being named, and it goes something like this: if someone bothers me, the problem is in them. The reaction is treated as evidence, as proof that the other person is doing something wrong, being something wrong. The intensity of the feeling is taken as confirmation of the original judgment. A stronger reaction becomes stronger proof. The feeling becomes self-validating. This assumption is rarely examined because it feels self-evident. Of course, the problem is in them. I am the one being affected. I did not ask to feel this way. The logic seems complete. There is no obvious gap in it. But there is something the assumption quietly sidesteps, and it has to do with the relationship between intensity and origin. Not all strong reactions are responses to strong provocations. Sometimes the strength of a reaction has less to do with what is in front of us and more to do with what is already inside us. Something familiar, something unresolved, something we have not looked at directly because we have been busy looking at everyone else. Think about what it means when the same behavior lands differently on different people. Two people sit in the same room, watch the same colleague do the same thing, and leave carrying entirely different weights. One person is mildly annoyed, the other cannot sleep. The behavior was identical. The difference lives somewhere else. The place where that difference lives is not something we are trained to investigate. We are trained to evaluate behavior, to decide if it was appropriate or inappropriate, reasonable or unreasonable. We are not trained to ask why our nervous system responded with a force that seems to exceed the event itself. That question tends to feel uncomfortable, so it goes unexamined. We return our attention to the other person, who remains the obvious and convenient source of the problem. And the irritation grows, not because the other person keeps doing more, but because the real conversation keeps being deferred. There is nothing in the social environment that encourages us to look inward when we feel provoked. If you tell someone you cannot stand a particular person, they are likely to ask what that person did. The question itself frames the problem outward. What did they do? What did they say? How did they behave? The conversation moves naturally toward the external. There is rarely a pause to ask what you brought into the room before they arrived. Workplaces do the same. Interpersonal friction is managed through process, policy, mediation. The focus is almost always on what happened between people, on behaviors, on incidents, on what can be observed and documented. The inner life of the person who is reactive rarely enters the conversation. It would feel inappropriate, even invasive, to suggest it should. Culture supports this framing at a broader level too. There is a long tradition of identifying difficult people and protecting oneself from them. Name the behavior, set limits, create distance, manage exposure, all of it directed outward toward the person causing the discomfort. This is considered not just reasonable but healthy. And there is a kind of social reward for recognizing that someone is problematic. You get agreement, you get validation. Others share their own stories about the same type of person. The outward framing becomes a shared narrative, reinforced by each retelling. The story calcifies. Even the language of popular psychology tends to point outward. Words like toxic, narcissistic, difficult, they describe the other person. They locate the source of the problem in external behavior. And while these descriptions are sometimes accurate, they can also function as a way of closing the investigation before it reaches anything uncomfortable. What there is very little support for is the harder question: why this person this much right now? That question makes people uncomfortable. It can feel like deflection, like letting the difficult person off the hook, like turning something external into something psychological when the behavior was genuinely real and genuinely happened. But the question is not about dismissing what occurred. It is not about declaring the other person innocent. It is about understanding why the charge is so heavy, why the irritation does not dissipate with time, why the mind keeps returning to the same scene, the same person, the same exchange that should have been forgotten weeks ago. The world does not often ask that question. and so most people never learn to ask it of themselves. They move from one difficult person to the next, carrying the same unexamined charge, wondering why certain dynamics keep repeating without quite seeing the thread that runs through all of them. Carl Jung spent a significant part of his work exploring a phenomenon he called projection. The idea is not complicated on the surface. We take parts of ourselves that we find difficult to acknowledge, qualities, impulses, desires, capacities, and we place them outside ourselves, onto other people. Then we react to those qualities as though they belong entirely to the other person and have nothing to do with us. The reaction feels fully justified because, from the inside, it is responding to something real. The other person does have the quality. The issue is not that we invented it. The issue is the disproportionate charge we bring to it. The issue is the way it becomes impossible to set down. The deeper implication of projection is something most people do not sit with long enough. The qualities that trigger the strongest reactions in others are often the qualities we most struggle to accept in ourselves. Not because we possess them in exactly the same form, but because something in us recognizes them. Something in us has an existing, unresolved relationship with that particular energy, and encountering it in another person activates that relationship. Jung called the part of us that holds these unacknowledged qualities the shadow, not a dark force in a dramatic sense, not a monster beneath the surface. Simply the parts of ourselves that have been pushed out of the light, qualities we learned were unacceptable, desires we were told to suppress, ways of being we judged as wrong or dangerous or embarrassing, and then buried beneath the person we decided to become. The shadow does not disappear through suppression. It is not neutralized by being ignored. It waits. And when it encounters itself in someone else, someone who is living openly what we have hidden, who moves through the world with a quality we have forbidden in ourselves, the reaction can be immediate and visceral. Sometimes the reaction is disgust. Sometimes it is fascination that cannot be fully explained. Sometimes it is both at the same time, which is its own kind of signal. The mixture of attraction and repulsion, the inability to look away even while insisting you want nothing to do with the person, that combination tends to suggest the dynamic is more personal than it appears. There is also a second idea in Jung's work that belongs here. He noticed that people tend to construct a persona, a curated, managed version of themselves shaped by what they believe others expect, what they have learned is safe, what has been rewarded. The persona is not false exactly. It is made of real qualities, but it is selective. It emphasizes certain things while quietly suppressing others. The tension between the persona we maintain and the fuller self underneath does not resolve on its own. It accumulates, and it tends to surface not through direct confrontation with ourselves, that would be too uncomfortable, but through reaction. Usually toward people who are doing without effort what we have forbidden ourselves to do. People who seem unburdened by the editing process we submit to every day. The persona looks at that freedom and calls it a flaw. Return to the story with this frame and something changes. The colleague who irritated her so deeply, confident, unguarded, direct, visibly at ease in her own opinions, unbothered by other people's discomfort, was not simply an external problem to be managed. She was, in some important sense, a mirror. Not a perfect one, not a flattering one, not one that reflected her accurately in every detail. A mirror in the specific sense that what she saw in the colleague and could not tolerate was something she already had a relationship with inside herself. The colleague was not a stranger in the way that word usually implies. She was a version of something familiar, something that had once been considered and then set aside, perhaps a long time ago. The grief that moved through her when the colleague made the room laugh, that was not about the colleague. That was about something she had quietly concluded was not available to her. Some version of ease in being seen. Some permission to take up space without calculating first whether it was warranted. Some freedom to be direct without softening it into something more palatable. She had buried something like that, maybe early, maybe slowly over years of learning that people who were too visible, too sure of themselves, attracted criticism. She had learned to be careful, to qualify, to make herself smaller in rooms where she actually wanted to be known. And she had learned this so thoroughly that it no longer felt like a choice. It felt like who she was. The colleague had apparently not learned those same lessons, or had encountered them and refused them, or had shed them somewhere along the way. The colleague moved through the same professional world without the same internal tax, and that was what could not be tolerated. Not the behavior itself, the freedom behind the behavior. The intensity of the reaction was not irrational, it was proportional. It was just proportional to the wrong thing. Not to what the colleague was doing in any given meeting, but to how far a particular quality had been exiled in herself and how long that exile had been in place. This is not a comfortable reframe. It does not make the colleague easier to be around. It does not resolve the friction or produce warmth where there was none. But it shifts the location of the real conversation, from the colleague's behavior to her own interior, from what is wrong with them to what is unresolved in me. That is a genuinely different question, and it points somewhere the original framing never could. The colleague did not need to change for this shift to matter. The insight was not about her. It was about the long-standing arrangement between a person and a part of herself she had declared off-limits, and what happens when that part keeps showing up in the room, wearing someone else's face. This is where the reflection becomes quiet. Not resolution, not a plan, not an instruction to go and do something about what has been noticed, just a particular quality of attention, one that stays open rather than rushing toward conclusion. Because if the people who trigger us most intensely are, in some way, reflecting something unacknowledged in ourselves, then the irritation is not simply an inconvenience to be managed. It is information. It is a signal pointing somewhere that has not yet been examined. And signals, when they are ignored, tend to get louder. That does not mean every strong reaction is projection. Some people do genuinely behave badly. Some situations are unjust. Some behavior deserves a strong response. The external reality does not dissolve simply because there is also an internal dimension worth attending to. Both things can be true at the same time. But the distinction worth making is between a reaction and an obsession, between noticing something and being unable to release it, between feeling provoked once and returning to the same mental scene for days, weeks, shaping the story a little further with each return. When the reaction has that quality, when it follows you home, when it occupies the quiet moments, when it resurfaces without being summoned, that is usually the signal worth pausing at. The shadow in Jung's framing is not a problem to be solved. It is not an enemy living inside you. It is simply the repository of what has not yet been integrated, what has been judged and suppressed rather than understood. And what has not been integrated tends to appear outside of us, dressed in the face of a colleague, a public figure, a stranger at a table who says something that should roll off and does not. What we exile in ourselves, we often encounter in the world, and we react to it there with a force that would not be available if the material were not already personal. Sitting with that awareness is not comfortable. It does not produce immediate relief. It does not generate a warmer feeling toward the person who provoked the reaction. What it produces is something quieter and more durable, a slightly clearer picture of what is actually happening, a loosening of the certainty that the problem lives entirely elsewhere. That loosening is not nothing. It changes what the discomfort is for. It opens a small gap between the feeling and the verdict the feeling has been used to confirm, and in that gap, something more honest can begin to form. There is also something worth noticing about repetition. When the same type of person keeps appearing in your life, different names, different faces, same essential irritation, that pattern is worth examining. It is rarely coincidence. It tends to be the shadow finding its way into view through whatever door is available, not to punish, but because something in the psyche is still trying to complete a conversation that was abandoned too soon. The people who trigger you most easily are not always the problem. Sometimes they are pointing, without knowing it, without trying, directly toward the part of you that has not yet been met. There is a different way to sit with the people who bother us. Not a forgiving way, not a strategic way, not an effort to dissolve the irritation or reframe it into something more comfortable before it has been honestly looked at. Just a quieter way, where the first question is not what is wrong with them, but what is this reaction asking me to notice? That shift in attention is not dramatic. It does not resolve anything quickly. It does not make difficult people easier to be around or undo the friction that is genuinely there. But it changes what the discomfort is for. Instead of functioning as evidence about the other person, the reaction becomes information about something interior. Something that has been waiting, perhaps for a long time, to be acknowledged rather than redirected outward. The colleague, the stranger, the person who gets under your skin in a way you cannot fully articulate, they are doing something, yes. And the something they are doing may be entirely real. But the charge, the weight, the part that follows you home, that comes from somewhere closer. And that is worth sitting with, not to fix it, not to arrive at a conclusion that makes the feeling go away, just to know it. To stop outsourcing the entire conversation to the person who happened to surface it. The reaction belongs to you, which means it also has something to tell you. That is worth a moment of stillness.